Welcome to DAO Deep Dives, where we interview DAO founders, core DAO contributors, and everyone else who works on the periphery of decentralized autonomous organizations.
Hello together. I'm super pumped about today's episode, diving into what Joseph is doing with the Catawba Nation and the Catawba Digital Economic Zone. We have had the pleasure to connect a couple times before, and he was actually a guest on my panel in East Denver at the beginning of this year. So fantastic to see you again, Joseph. How's it going?
Absolutely doing great. It's a pleasure as always.
Very cool, man. So I think we just want to get started by finding out a little bit about you, even just as a human, regardless of what you're actually working on. So it'd be cool just to find out, who is Joseph?
For sure. So I'll try to make this short because of the big story, the protagonist, and the story of the zone is the Catawba Indian Nation. But since you asked, my background is in policy. And so I studied political science and originally wanted to go run for office, but I found that a career in politics would lead me to be, one, miserable, two, unfulfilled because I wouldn't actually get anything done, and probably end up making morally questionable decisions as a consequence. At the same time, I realized that entrepreneurship, actually demonstrating an idea out into the world and then scaling it if it succeeds, was actually doing some considerable good at the time. Arab Spring was being brought forth through social media. Uber and Airbnb were making reforms to licenses in taxis or in hotels and what have you. And Bitcoin was becoming a bigger part of the world. So I decided to start in entrepreneurship. And while having our first startup in the crypto space, me and my co-founder, we realized that there was a bunch of projects that were experimenting with new policies on a small level. These are normally called special economic zones, or areas within a host nation that have different policies to attract residents and businesses. But we realized some of the more innovative types of these projects kept failing because they kept making the same mistakes. So we thought, okay, what if there's an organization that was spreading best practices and connecting these people together so they would have a better chance of succeeding? And so we found startup societies. And it started out as a tiny blog, but then ballooned into this larger organization with trade show conferences, a how-to guide for how to build private special economic zones, as well as the only active journal in the space of special jurisdictions and special economic zones. And by working in that space, I developed a private practice of consulting special zone projects. And then I was reached out to by a member of this Catawba Indian Nation Special Economic Zone team. And since then, I've been working on the project.
So let's just stay there then. Tell us a bit about Catawba and what that is and what you've been working on specifically there.
Yeah, so the Catawba Indian Nation, they are a people that have existed here in the Carolinas for thousands of years, all the way from Virginia down to Georgia, along the Catawba River Valley. And they're not just a huge historical force here in what is now the United States, but also in U.S. history and its formation. In fact, they fought on the side of the Patriots in the Revolutionary War. In fact, they fought alongside George Washington against the British. So they were very fundamental to that. And there's one of the most famous Catawba citizens. His Anglicized name is Chief Haggler, because he was a great negotiator, both on the business level and with local polities like the Cherokee and the British and what have you. And in fact, if you look at our logo, that is a stylized relief of King Haggler. But despite being really tied to U.S. history, the Catawba Indian Nation, like many tribal nations, actually lost their sovereignty in the 1940s under federal policy. Thankfully, almost all tribes actually regained their sovereignty after fighting back, including the Catawba in 1993. But as a condition of their returning their sovereignty, they made an agreement with South Carolina, stating that they would not set up a casino. So they had to be creative about how they leverage their sovereignty for economic development. So they started thinking about different ways, including special economic zones. And because they were trying to formulate how to make it work, they reached out to our organization or members of our organization, startup societies, and said, okay, how do we make it work? And like most U.S. citizens, when I heard about Tribal Sovereignty Project, I rolled my eyes viciously and said, yeah, this will never work. We all know how this stuff works in U.S. history. I can say with complete joy, I was totally and completely wrong. Tribes do have sovereignty, and it's really big.
That's amazing. I love to hear that, since both Solve and I live in a place in the U.S. where we have a good connection to tribes ourselves.
Sven, let me just tell our listeners that aren't watching on video, I was just pointing to the Zia symbol, which is a state symbol of New Mexico, but comes from the Pueblo of Zia. So the Zia people, we're basically that's on loan to us overall as a state, but definitely a lot of Native American history here and indigenous history here in New Mexico, where Sven and I happen to be right now.
Yep.
Absolutely. In fact, I don't know if New Mexico has Navajo reservation within their state, but the head of the Department of Interior now is a Navajo woman, and it's a demonstration that tribal governments are now becoming more and more embedded within the very fabric of of federalism here in the United States.
Amazing. So before we go too much deeper into what the CDEC is and what you guys are doing, we always ask our guests that one question, which you can answer however you like. It doesn't need to be literal. It can be just your interpretation. But what is a DAO to you?
Yeah. So that's a sticky question, because I think pretty much everyone in DAOs will probably say we don't quite know yet. But basically, the commonality is it has something to do with digital assets, and it has a non-standard organizational structure that doesn't fit within the traditional corporate structure. And there's a need for greater flexibility and experimentation. A lot of purists will say it'll have to be on a distributed ledger, I mean the basic infrastructure of how it communicates and is governed through smart contracts. And I'd say maybe there's a different layer of purists that say that it actually has to be automized, that a lot of it is conducted automatically, or maybe even there's an AI component to it all. But as a jurisdiction, our general philosophy is that we're not here to pick winners and losers, but just to simply provide a platform where you can adjudicate disputes, understand, clear cut the rules of the road in law, and then let entrepreneurs then develop what the solutions are. And I think we've achieved that balance with our legal code and our regulations.
Very cool. Thanks for the answer. What is a special economic zone? Let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, a special economic zone is a special jurisdiction within a larger jurisdiction or host country. And their goal is to spur economic development, to increase technology transfer, to experiment with different policies that can't be tried on a nationwide level. So some of the biggest examples are Shenzhen, for instance. Shenzhen, if you're not familiar, was a fishing village of about 30,000 people in the 80s. And then 2010s, it grew to 18 million and has the same GDP as Portugal, Ireland, or Vietnam. So that's insane. That's the type of growth you normally see with a startup or a digital asset or what have you. But it's with the real estate development, the building of a city. That's why they have the term startup societies or startup cities. Another big example is actually Dubai. I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but Dubai used to be just wasteland, essentially. But what they did is they created 40 different special economic zones to attract different businesses and capital. And as we all know, it was nothing in the 90s and 2000s. And then it became the global city where all your business buddies brag about attending some sort of conference at least once a year.
You mentioned earlier CDEZ. So, what makes the CDEZ special? And is it specifically designed for DAOs and Web3, or how does it relate to what we do on a daily basis?
Yes, CDEZ stands for Catawba Digital Economic Zone. We chose, that's the DBA, the official legal name of the zone is a Green Earth Zone. And that's because of that refers to a specific part of the reservation. So the code itself can be for all forms of businesses. In fact, our tagline is to disrupt Delaware. However, whenever you are focused on, when you're a new company or new organization or a new jurisdiction, you need to focus on a target market to attract a niche and then scale from there. The biggest example is, for instance, Facebook. They didn't try to boil the ocean and try to get the whole globe to use their platform. They first try to secure a niche at Ivy League universities, then public universities, then colleges, then the general public. Likewise, we want to focus on a niche and scale from there. And it seemed to us that one of the most underserved for company and corporation purposes was very clearly Web3. There's a lack of clarification under existing law that makes them not be able to grow. There's a limiting factor. So within the code, the zone has the capability of crafting and promulgating rules for all forms of companies, but it specifically talks about how they have the power to talk about digital assets, securities, banking, what have you. And over the last year or so, we've passed numerous regulations on digital assets, including creating specific definitions under existing law, including being the first jurisdiction to create a definition for a non-fungible token. Then we were the first jurisdiction to adopt the Uniform Law Commission's amendments to the UCC, incorporating digital assets under that code. Then we passed that regulation recognizing DAOs as limited liability companies and as UNAs, and I'm sure we'll talk about that soon. And we passed a banking code that will allow one to charter a bank under the laws of the Catawba Indian Nation, similar to how you can in Wyoming, Delaware, or North Dakota.
Very fascinating. So I'll jump in here real quick with something I saw on another interview you gave not too long ago, where you said, "Code's not law, law is law." And that made me smirk at the time when I watched it.
Yeah, I think I
And
saw a dev next to me at a coffee shop in Denver throw his laptop over that.
yeah,
I bet.
and I think we have people in our respective networks, which we all know, who wear those Code's Law hats, which those are fantastic people.
Yeah.
And which is why I wanted to pick this one out as a bit of a controversial one. And just wanted to ask you what you mean by that. I don't think it's your intention to rub any of the DAO or Web3 maxis the wrong way. So give us kind of the explanation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will, and I don't, it's not a binary. In fact, one of the biggest arbitrages of digital assets and smart contracts is that we automate a lot of the functions that are normally associated with compliance and law and regulation, and to create a more efficient way to run organizations. But if you're looking at the core value of law, it is interpretation to deal with disputes and to deal with conflicts. And at this point, until we have the AI God, ultimately that's arbitered by not just something that's in plain text, but on decision making that is made by individual humans. And the biggest example that I actually gave on that show was about the Slockit DAO. And I think a very similar scenario happened on that show that almost exactly repeated the Slockit DAO. So for those that aren't familiar, though, if you're on the DAO Deep Dive show, you should probably be familiar with it. The original Slockit DAO failed because there was a white hat hacker. At least in their mind, they were a white hat hacker. And they took the gains from their hack. And then members of the DAO, they actually worked with Ethereum to actually reverse those transactions so that the funds would be returned. And that hacker actually, I don't know how far the litigation went, but they at least said they were going to sue the Slockit DAO because of, according to the principle of code is law, what they did was completely legal because of the contract, so to speak, whereas the smart contracts. And as a white hat hacker, he was simply taking the gains based on the contract. So he was obeying the very rules. But everyone knows that when you have a contract, you also have intention and the spirit of it. And that can't always be encapsulated in code. So what you need is you need to have an arbiter or someone that is reviewing a case that can understand that. So yes, you can have Ricardian contracts where you have a smart contract that's coherent with a written contract. And you certainly should use smart contracts as much as feasible and as much as its marginal utility allows. But at the end of the day, until we have the AI demigods or whatever you want to call it, it's just not wise to automate it because you're just going to get more and more of those cases, as there's been plenty already.
Thanks for bringing that up. It's an interesting story for sure. I was a member of that DAO. Can you believe that ETC is still a thing? It's interesting, and I respect the fact that it's still a thing, but I totally forget about Classic all the time. And it's what's even happening here anymore. You could say the same thing with several forks of Bitcoin as well. Yeah, even though it was so crazy, it is very fond memories though, going through that entire experience, at least looking back on it now. So CDEZ, let's just talk about how the zone is governed actually.
Yeah, very cool. First, let's talk about the framework itself and how it fits within the wider context. Federally recognized Indian tribes, they are domestic dependent nations within the United States. So Congress has authority over them only if Congress is super specific about what rights they are removing. And in the cases where they do not, those rights are assumed to be retained by the tribe. So what this gives them is the status of a state, except for higher in many cases, because states, they don't have that burden. Congress doesn't have to have that burden that they have to be hyper-specific. In that case, that's how they fit within the federalist ecosystem. And then how the Catawba Indian Nation works is that they have a government that's made up of the General Council, which is essentially their legislature, which is made up of all voting age citizens. So if there's any legislation that has to be passed, it has to be passed by that body. So what we did is that we worked with the Catawba Indian Nation's attorneys and leadership to develop a legislative package. And that was passed overwhelmingly into law by the Catawba Indian Nation's legislature, the General Council. And what that law created, in addition to the commercial code and corporate code, was two governing bodies. One of them is the Zone Authority, which is a mixture of a Secretary of State / financial services regulator. and that is governed by a 5-person commission of Catawba citizens. And they promulgate regulations at the same level as the U.S. state. And they meet every couple of weeks to make new rules and regulations. The law also created a for-profit management company, which is consistent with for-profit special economic zones around the world that provide services, financing, and software for the managing the special economic zone. And that's the organization that I am the CEO of. And that is 51% owned by the nation. And that is a non-dilutable 51%. And we also provide feedback in terms of actually helping draft these rules and regulations.
So fascinating. You mentioned these regulating bodies you put in place. So tell us a bit what has passed already so far. Banking regulations, DAO regulations, stablecoin and digital asset regulations are the 4 top of mind. How do they differ from the rest of the US? And why are those more attractive alternatives for all of our listeners?
On the digital asset ends, first and foremost, the vast majority of states, with the exception of maybe Wyoming, do not have any digital asset rules. So even in the case of Delaware, which is renowned for its case law and providing a good, solid basis for running a business, at the end of the day, there is a huge uncertainty associated with how your digital assets will be treated in a dispute. So as a consequence, you have an added extra cost of uncertainty whenever you register a Delaware company. And with Wyoming, they have a really good framework, but some of the digital asset definitions are a little bit wonky, and they've had some criticism, and they don't have the amendments to the UCC like we do, which provides a technologically neutral framework that's tied within a consistent code that's used across all US states. The way that Wyoming set it up is they had to do definitions strictly around their property code because they didn't want to touch the Uniform Commercial Code, because if they changed their Uniform Commercial Code without that being blessed by the Uniform Commercial Law Commission, they would be out of sync with everywhere else in the United States. As a consequence, they had to have tape and glue with their property code to make it fit around. So this is a lot more streamlined. We do have some of the definitions from Wyoming to provide some extra specificity. So we provide the best of both worlds there. In terms of DAOs, and I'll zoom in on that because I know it's most important for your users. So DAOs, we do have a regulation that allows you to be recognized as limited liability companies like Wyoming, but we provide some extra benefits. For one, there's a little bit less red tape in regards to what's necessary for an LLC. Within a zone, there isn't a plug that Wyoming can pull at any moment for any DAO LLCs with the Catawba. Also, you don't have a requirement of have to have your public identifier be a smart contract when you incorporate, because some DAOs, they might be early on. And to be frank, a lot of DAOs are, in fact, at this point, just Discord groups. They might have a white paper. So in that case, you can actually link to those groups or to the white papers so when you do the incorporation process, and that allows the users to know, where to go to know the governance of the DAO. And also we include some definitions that are used by other jurisdictions like Tennessee for the definition of smart contract in the case of the DAO. But the part where we really innovate in terms of DAOs is something that we have in the regulation, but we're going to be rolling out in terms of tech. And that is unincorporated nonprofit associations. So there's been a couple in the space that have been talking about or even using this model. Miles Jennings of A16Z is very famous and working on it. In fact, his proposals are like the bedrock of what we did to create this regulation. And what it entails is essentially, rather than an incorporated entity like a limited liability company or corporation, et cetera, it is essentially a collection of individuals that are working together to a common good. However, unlike a general partnership, which all DAOs are by default unless they have a legal wrapper, there is limited liability. So if they're working together, that liability isn't on the person. And if the company gets into some sort of trouble, their assets will be protected, meaning the individual contributors' assets will be protected. And the reason why that's beneficial for DAOs is that it's more native to the concept of a DAO, which is that type of flexibility. And that's an experimental nature. And in fact, unlike limited liability companies, there's very few statutory requirements for an UNA. And in fact, almost everything is governed by what they call the governing principles, which could be a written agreement among all the members, or it could be a smart contract or even a verbal agreement. So that provides greater flexibility there. So what we want to do to fully enable it, though, is that we want each of the members of the DAO, in order to tie themselves to the jurisdiction of the zone, as well as to maintain compliance, is that they have to pass KYC with the Catawba Indian Nation's platform and then are issued a DID. based on that. So they can take that DID, and any group that has DIDs for all their members can be constructed as an UNA in that case and have limited liability. And they're signified that they are in fact governed by the Catawba Indian Nation.
Just to clarify for our listeners, what's a DID?
Yeah, so a DID is a decentralized identifier. It's like a digital ID, but it's associated to a distributed ledger.
And specifically, what is the nation issuing those on?
Yes, so the zone authority in this case, which is a part of the nation, they will have to make a final determination on that. But we're looking at a couple of protocols and we're experimenting with a couple. And I know that we don't want to get into the weeds of maximalism and what have you, but there are some chains that have large developer communities and are robust and what have you. And while we will never make any policies based on technology, for the sake of making a DID, there might be specific standards out there that we're looking at that might be choosing one chain over another.
Yeah, I mean, it should be use case specific. And then who's to say your DID can't be wrapped and utilized elsewhere? So nice. I read something about stablecoin regulation surrounding that. Can you maybe double click on that? That's a pretty interesting topic. And I wonder how much thought has gone into that.
Yes. So our stablecoin regulation, it's what they call out for comment, meaning that the public has time to look at it and to review it and to give feedback on it. And essentially what it entails is that in order to be a payment stablecoin within our jurisdiction, you have to be a regulated financial entity within the zone. So a chartered bank, a money transmitter, a speedy, and what have you. And you have to have your assets be one-to-one with your token. And those assets have to be things like they're highly liquid, like bank deposits or treasuries or common stock of non-volatile public companies.
Non-volatile public company. Wonder what the thresholds are on that.
Yeah, so we use definitions that are already under federal law.
Cool. So what about a basket of digital currencies backing your stablecoin? This isn't something that's allowable currently, or?
I'm not quite sure. I think actually you are allowed to peg it to foreign government assets like foreign treasuries and what have you, and I believe foreign fiat currencies as well. I don't know about a basket. I'd have to confirm on that.
Or really just anything. I was just thinking like Liquidity Protocol with LUSD being backed by ETH. You have things like Reserve and their new R tokens, where you can actually just create a stable coin based on the basket that you provide specifically, and many other mechanisms for stable coins that are interesting. So just wanted to know where the line was drawn.
I'll tell you what, here's the benefit of us being a nimble jurisdiction. You go on the website, go down to governance and upcoming regulations, you take a read on it, and then send us a message about where you think we can do better. And the beautiful thing about us, unlike Delaware and Wyoming, we'll actually respond back. And then we might even integrate it within the actual rule that's put out there.
Love that. A little to-do list for the listeners. I'm sure somebody's going to jump in and lean into that. I guess while we're on that real quick, can you motivate them to do, maybe if they're not located in the Carolinas, this is going a little bit outside of what our next question was, but how can this expand maybe beyond just the Carolinas and into other kind of sovereign lands, or I should say lands that are controlled indigenously?
You can set up a company right now where you are in New Mexico, or someone in Estonia can, or someone in Saudi Arabia. This isn't something that's local. You have to be a Carolinian. Literally, the goal of this is to become the hub globally for digital assets and then to disrupt Delaware. So that's why it's important for y'all. This could be the actual home of digital assets. And in contrast to places like El Salvador and what have you, which have their benefits and their drawbacks, but their benefits, it's within the United States. And that is so fundamentally important. And I know, just like anyone else, that the United States has had a relative decline in many aspects. But at the end of the day, what they are known for in their brand and what they still maintain relative to the rest of the world is rule of law, a great financial system, and the largest market for retail investors in the world. So if you're able to provide the best jurisdiction, the most nimble jurisdiction for digital assets, and have that nested within one of the best places to do business and finance in the world, then you just have the trifecta necessary to make sure that digital assets are growing and thriving worldwide.
Yeah, this brings us right into what I'm quite intrigued about the CDEZ one of which is, you mentioned three of them. The third one I wanted to touch on a bit more as well, which is the banking regulation. I think especially for DAOs or online native communities of whatever sort, I think banking is still quite challenging. Even just paying your hosting provider or something like that, right? Like it's these little things which are mostly probably just managed by individual members these days. So give us a glimpse into what's coming up with banking from your side and how can that improve how DAOs operate today?
Yeah, absolutely. Today, even outside of the bank chartering code, we are working with banks that already said that they're open to working with Catawba DAOs. So if you go on our website and you make a company, after you've done your company, fill out a form about what your banking needs are, and we'll connect you to the right people, including offshore banks as well as US banks that are willing to service Catawba DAOs. In terms of our banking code, the best thing to do in law isn't to start something de novo. The best thing to do is work with what already exists and has been time tested, but get rid of some of the fat and the red tape and mix and match it to the best combination possible. And that's what we did to a T with our banking code. Our banking code is based on the banking codes of South Dakota, which has the most assets under management of any state code in the United States. Wyoming, because it has the most regulations that enable digital assets, as well as North Dakota. And North Dakota is interesting because it has the Public Bank of North Dakota. And essentially what it would create is the public bank of the zone in Catawba that would essentially serve as a governor as well as a bank of banks of all of our charters. And within our application process, you can set up a full service bank, you can set up a credit union, you can set up a money transmitter, a special depository institution, et cetera. And where we are with that right now is that we're developing a list of possible commissioners who will be responsible for reviewing and issuing bank charters within the zone.
Amazing. So another thing which we have spitballed on before, and I want to get back to, and I think it's on the roadmap, and correct me if I'm wrong here, or if you're already further ahead, which is security sales. Hot topic in the world of digital assets and startups alike. And one of the ideas we touched on previously was enabling like this Reg CF crowdfunding type of model within your special economic zone to do an internal crowdfunding, I want to call it, meaning that if I have a startup in that zone and we're doing a crowdfund, that anyone who is also a resident or a organization registered in that zone can participate in that crowdfunding on the outside of current SEC regulations. And I might be oversimplifying this here, so please dive into that because I think that's super fascinating.
So we're actively researching that area, so I can't go into too much detail, but I will say this, that states have enormous authority under the SEC's own regulations for what constitutes blue sky regulation, what's under their jurisdiction, including with crowdfunding. So we are in the process of reviewing what is possible under the federal framework for securities and blue sky laws. But I do believe it could provide one of the most beneficial safe harbors in the United States in a completely compliant fashion.
I think one of the things I was trying to get to earlier was something I read, the CDEZ e-resident program. Why would somebody want to become an e-resident, and how do they take advantage of that?
E-residency in this case, and maybe that's just bad copy on our part, is essentially having an LLC at this point. And the benefit of that is that your company gets to be under a commercial code and corporate code and a regulatory body that respects digital assets. So that's the main arbitrage there.
Cool. And then, so if you were to, I guess, register a company then there, does that automatically include you being issued the DID, or because you need to be like the registered agent, for example, of that organization?
So the flow that we're envisioning right now is that, the flow as it is right now is the incorporator and then the directors have to be KYC'd. And then after they KYC, then they can create a company. So the flow as it will be envisioned is after they do the KYC process, the individual will be issued the DID. So then they would have the DID after that, and then they can create a company. And then also we would like to issue a DID for each company that's incorporated, which can essentially serve as a certificate of good standing that can be used for DD purposes and can be verified using a distributed ledger.
You mentioned now that directors of a corporation need to be KYC'd. Are UNAs the same? Do you have directors in UNAs? And How does that work from that, just relating to what you just answered, basically?
I'd have to double check the code, but if I remember correctly, it's really flexible. It's basically determined by your governing framework. I think with the limited liability code, there certainly is a necessity to have a traditional president or secretary or what have you. To be honest, with any organization, you need to have a signatory. You need to have an individual that can sign documents and what have you that, will actually be interfacing with the bank. So you'll probably have to have some sort of, just by doing a business in the real world, you will have different positions that are akin to a director or executive or what have you. But how that's structured and how that's named, I believe that UNA is very flexible about how that's structured.
And in theory, that can be a smart contract, right? That signatory.
Oh, that's a very interesting legal question. I don't think at this point a protocol can, let's, for instance, conduct KYC for a bank and then sign on the behalf of the company. But I don't know if anyone has tried. That's very
my head goes back to Kali and Otoko. Are you familiar with those two? Which are incorporation of an LLC or an organization through smart contracts. And those are series LLCs, so there's nuance here. But in that case, there is no one else than the actual smart contracts to transact with.
Well, I will say at this point, with our code, you need to have an individual incorporate the entity. So there needs to be at least someone that's setting that up. But beyond that, within our legal system, we haven't set up rules for that. But I imagine each bank or financial institution or different organizations can have their own policies. And in fact, one of the things that we want to do is to explore AI regulations and the parameters behind that and explore what we can provide in terms of clarity or arbitrage for companies worldwide.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to be figuring that out for the next 50 years. It feels like trying to catch up to what is legal and what is not surrounding AI.
And again, we want to crowdsource the answers here. That's particularly what we want to do. We don't have all the right answers. There's a market feedback loop of exactly what these rules and regulations, how they'll develop. So as we're developing regulations or even our existing regulations, it's up to the community to give that feedback, and then we can integrate that and review that if necessary.
Let's talk about crowdsourcing, our basically user experience, right? And that seems to be at the center of the platform that you've developed. Why is that so important? And how can users, or what can users do on the platform now?
Yeah, we're the only jurisdiction that I know of that has a Discord for their comment period. So use that. We're on Telegram. You can go on our website. You can go to upcoming regulations, and then you can give feedback on that via email or those sources. Just engage in the community there. Give your feedback.
Cool. I think we should talk about taxes. So how should our listeners think about CDEZ and their tax planning? You say disrupt Delaware. How does it differ from Delaware or Wyoming as far as tax planning goes?
So it doesn't. And that's what I want to be clear about. This is not a tax arbitrage situation. We have the same tax status as Delaware, which is great. People from around the world go to Delaware, not just for a business incorporation rule of law standpoint, but because of internationally it's seen as like a favorable place for taxes. But we don't impact your federal taxes. However, there are specific benefits for hiring Catawba citizens. You get a 20% tax credit for each Catawba citizen that you hire.
Nice. And that's regardless in what kind of industry the product that you're maybe building is focused on.
As long as they're a W-2.
Wow. Cool.
Before we go into more free-form questions, because this is such a big, huge project, right? Fundamentally, I can hardly wrap my head around. So I do want to check in with you if there is anything you would like to talk about which we have not touched on from the day-to-day working on this project. What other interesting things are happening which you would like to tell us about?
Honestly, we're covering all the basics that I can talk about right now. Stable coins, talking about the DID and what have you. Just a couple things I want to make it clear. This project is because of the sovereignty and the foresight of the Catawba Indian Nation. They are the protagonists here. They're the ones that pushed this forward and voted this overwhelmingly into law. And as majority stakeholders in the project and governors, and as people who have been jumping at this opportunity to service this industry. And I also want to make it clear that they're interested in this. And this project is not a workaround. This is a work through. This is working within the existing framework that exists in the Constitution, federal law, and federal regulations. This is a new form, or kind of an existing form of federalism, just tried out in a different way. Not because of we believe that in order for digital assets to exist, there needs to be a workaround, but because we know that digital assets can fit under existing law, but they haven't been given an opportunity to. And then with nimble jurisdictions like the Catawba, they're able to provide that nimbleness and that knowledge base that's necessary to make this industry thrive. So if you're looking to work under consistent rules and work under a system of law within the United States, this is the place you're going to do it, and you should be governed by the Catawba Indian Nation.
I appreciate that you're highlighting that. Let's go a little lighter hearted here for the next couple of questions. And one of our favorites is always to project out 10x, 100x into the future, which I'm sure with a project like yours, you are doing that every day, thinking about very long-term impacts of what you're doing, but also what DAOs could do. This is DAO Deep Dives after all. So where do you think we're going? What's the big picture here, 10x, 100x into the future?
In terms of governance, I've already touched on a bit of it. Indian nations are already firmly within the United States system, but for very well-known historical reasons, they haven't been able to live out their full potential. They have the legal authority to act just like states in regards to commercial law and business regulation, but haven't been allowed to because of these problems. They've been doing one-off businesses and jurisdictional arbitrage, like in gaming and payday lending, but they haven't really grown to their full sovereign capability. And what this project enables is the ability for tribes to grow into it and form that new form of federalism. So you're going to start seeing the United States less as a collection of states in the federal government, but also as a collection of different special jurisdictions in the United States, partially led by tribes. So that's going to be a big thing moving forward. In terms of the digital asset space, you're going to see digital assets sort of as software has, standard software has been. You're going to start eating things. I think a couple of years ago, people were saying if a company doesn't have a digital asset strategy, it's not going to be there in 10 or 20 years. Because ultimately, the goal of digital assets is to become boring. You know, to the standards that run the internet, only like hardcore tech people are understanding of. And that should be the case. It should just be infrastructure. And I see a lot of that. But the flip side of that is it's also going to create things that we just did not expect. No one expected Uber, which if you look at it with some objectivity, is totally freaking strange. You're literally calling a stranger on your phone and you're jumping in the car without ever knowing them. People, when they first started the internet, they didn't predict that. They didn't predict Airbnb. And these seems like banal examples now, but we have no idea what DAOs will do. There hasn't been the killer use case yet. So expect some weird and beneficial things that come out of it and for it to fit within an emerging framework of how governance is done in the United States.
Nice. Beautiful. Let's talk about something that maybe you've just thought of and then just giggled and didn't really feel like telling anybody out loud. So what's the craziest idea that you think should be a DAO or that you thought of could be a DAO that's just wild?
I leave it up to y'all as the entrepreneurs to come up with the crazy stuff.
You're taking yourself out of that? You're not one of us?
I am, but I'm not, but I'm very specific. I hyper-focus on one thing, and I try to get that done as much as possible, and I almost put blinders to everything else. So in a sense, I have a bigger picture, but in one sense, I'm hyper-focused.
All right, let's talk about just how people can get involved specifically with what you're doing. What kind of help do you need? What is actually going to move the needle for you? What's the call out?
Yeah, so if you have a digital asset company, don't go abroad. Federal agencies have jurisdiction everywhere anyways, and they're not going to have as good a legal system, and they're not going to have access to retail investors. Come back to the United States, come into a place that actually respects digital assets. So whether that's your company or your DAO, you should come here. Also, different organizations that work with incorporating companies like VCs, accelerators, et cetera, you should start making recommendations to your companies to start incorporating here. For different service providers like banks and exchanges, include Catawba in the drop-down menu that you have so you can start servicing Catawba entities. And yeah, just give feedback on our rules and regulations so we can have the most stress-tested legal system out there.
Huge.
Yeah.
I got all excited for certain parts, and I want to also look way further into this now. I've just followed the Wyoming stuff pretty closely. I was advisor to a company that was traveling to Wyoming a lot during that time. And helped writing some of that set of laws that came into existence eventually. Took a while. So it's cool to see maybe even better opportunities happen for Web3 native companies in yet another economic zone. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And one thing before we conclude, that's one of our fundamental benefits. Wyoming, I'm a huge fan of Caitlin Long and all those legislatures and what they've done, but they have a limiting factor. They meet every 2 years. Did you know that? They can have a general legislative session every 2 years. We meet every couple of weeks. So by the time that they're talking about it and the blockchain commission that they have on a regular basis, we can put it out for comment by the time they're going to lunch. Happy to work with all jurisdictions, but I do think we have a competitive advantage worldwide.
So fantastic. I think I want to highlight one more thing for our listeners before we sign off for today. That call to action for comment is fantastic. I think even though you're not a DAO, you're embracing kind of the Web3 ethos of collaborating on innovation and in large, complex systems such as jurisdictions. So I urge every listener who is interested in this topic to go to the website. We'll have all of those links in the show notes. And yeah, just thank you so much again, Joseph, for coming on the show. Thoroughly enjoyed talking to you today.
Perfect. Likewise. Thank you, gentlemen.
And that's a wrap. Sven and Solve are your hosts for DAO Deep Dives, a podcast about all things DAO. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.